Okay. As everybody knows, because you signed up for this, we are here to hear from Jeni McFarland, who is a local Michigan author, which is so awesome to see an author having success that is writing about places that we know. And I know that everybody loves that in our area for sure. Jeni wrote The House of Deep Water, which was a hot read last year and is still in holds for us. So if you have not read it, I think most people that are signing up for this have, but if you have not read it, you will want to put yourself on hold for it if you want to get it anytime soon. She also wrote Growth. If you attended our Tales and Talk last week, we had, I believe it was Megan, had a really in-depth talk about the short story Growth. So I know that was really interesting. I hear that was a really interesting talk because people were kind of mixed on like, oh, I've never read that kind of like literary short story before, so they had mixed responses, but most people loved it, but they also thought, how could that happen? Some people want to have very literal reactions to a short story. But most people did love it. You were talking about being nervous, and now you put it on me, and now I'm like, I don't know how to introduce you. She has a lot of things to say, and you're going to want to hear it. So,
thank you. So my novel came out last April, right as coronavirus was hitting the country. So I hear that some of the people in the audience today haven't read it. I'm going to start with a short excerpt from the book. And all you really need to know for this excerpt is the main character, Beth, has just moved back to the small farm village where she grew up. And this is right as their neighbor has been arrested for just horrific crimes that she was a victim of growing up. So she's in this excerpt, they're sitting in the driveway. They just arrived. So they arrive in Riverbend around midnight. Beth had wanted to avoid driving at night, but they'd gotten a late start and made more stops than she anticipated. And now here she is, returning home to the town that once upon a time she couldn't wait to leave. They're not in the driveway yet. This is a different excerpt. The way back isn't quite as she remembered. The new highway bypass throws her for a loop. It's as if Riverbend wants to be left behind, forgotten. Even in the dark, Beth can tell the town has changed only for the worse. Somewhere in the intervening years, the village installed lampposts that look like gas lights, someone's kitschy idea of sprucing the place up. The new lights sort of resemble the Gaslight Village at the Melder Museum in Kalamazoo, her favorite exhibit when she was a child, a life-sized diorama of how Riverbend would have looked in 1850. The museum, however, had flickering lights that looked like real flames. The static bulbs in the lights along Main Street are stubbornly unchanging, like the village itself. The potholes on Main Street are like trenches she has to rumble the car over, and most of the storefronts downtown are boarded up. Riverbend was never a booming place, but now it's just the skeleton of a town. As she pulls into the alley behind her father's house, the trees and garages lean close, bearing down on her. Beth finds herself taking great gulps of air and is glad her kids are both asleep, that she has a moment to pull herself together after parking. The house had blurred in her mind over the years. In the darkness, it seems to have grown larger. She knows it's painted pale yellow, but for the life of her, she now has trouble making it out against the sky. There's no moon out tonight. The alley behind her is dark, the street lamp burned out. She stares at her father's house, trying to discern the pitch of the roof, the stairs leading up to the back door, anything. She should be able to find a happy memory of it. This is the house where she spent her early childhood, the house where they lived when her family was still whole. And yet, even as she strains her mind, all she can come up with are memories of Gilmer Thurber here, in this house, his presence in every corner, filling the house like dark water. The longer she stares, the harder it is to see, so that she finds herself turning away, giving the house the side eye, trying to trick it into materializing. Next to her, Dan snores quietly. Jeanette shifts in her sleep and gives an unhappy whimper. Beth knows the house stands there, yet the lot seems to be full of stars in space, with distant planets dotting the wall facing her. The Milky Way is folded into the roof. Her eyes are sore and dry. She finds herself dozing, her head drooping onto her chest, and then her eyes blink open. She could close them just for a second, if only her mind would quiet. Instead, she stares at the house until its eastern-facing wall grows pale, until the sky around blues and brightens. At first, she thinks it's a trick of the light, but as the dawn comes on stronger, the house looks blue and stays blue. It's been painted recently, she realizes. It's only the third week in September, and the mulberry tree in the backyard is a sunny yellow, its leaves dropping to the grass beneath. A light goes on inside the kitchen, and she can see her father, Ernest DeWitt, through the gauzy curtains, poking around in the fridge, the pantry, making coffee. At the sink, he pauses, tilts his head, then reaches out to push the curtains aside. "Wake up," Beth says quietly, and when Dan stirs next to her, she adds, "We're here." She has to tell herself, get out of the car, go inside the house. She shakes her head. Dan wakes his sister, and Jeanette comes briefly to life in that moment when her body is awake before her brain has booted up. "It's morning," Jeanette says. "I slept in a car all night." She seems proud of this fact, like it's the kind of bohemian lifestyle she's always longed for. Even as her kids open doors and stretch in the new sun, even as Beth's father greets his grandchildren for the first time since they were little, Beth keeps telling herself, get out of the car. Jeanette walks right up to Ernest DeWitt and hugs him, and something inside Beth stirs violently. She spills out of the driver's seat and onto the driveway. "Eliza," her father says, and just hearing her childhood name makes her bowels turn to ice. He has his arms held open to her. She doesn't want to forgive him so easily. She doesn't want to hug him, doesn't want to be here, yet here she is, standing dumb and tired in the driveway as the smile he wears grows strained around the eyes. His face sags at the jowls. His glasses are crooked on his nose, and she finds herself staring at him. She'd forgotten the details of his face, and she wonders briefly whether he really is her father. They look nothing alike, and not just because he's white. The round, upturned nose, too small for his face, and the fleshy jaw. His arms, those strong, tan arms, go heavy, they droop, and Beth inserts herself into them to prop them up. "It's good to see you," he says, and kisses her forehead. "When did you get in?" "I was waiting, but I fell asleep on the couch." "You painted the house," is all Beth can say. "It was Linda's idea," he says, and he turns as the back door claps shut. There, standing on the stoop, is a girl Beth recognizes immediately. Dirty blonde hair, a little too much makeup smudged from sleep, Linda Williams. When she was in high school, Beth used to babysit the Williams girls. Linda would have been about 10, old enough to stay home alone, really, except their mother seemed keen to foist the girls off on anyone else. Beth wonders what her father is doing with this child, but it occurs to her that, creepy as it is, their relationship makes a kind of sense. There's something of the child in Ernest's gaze, something that feels like a game of hide and seek. When you look into his eyes, you might catch a glimpse of a shoe or a pigtail disappearing around a corner, but when you follow it, it's gone. Speaking with Ernest, it's easy to lose all track of the present. You're so focused on seeking out the child, hiding. This wouldn't be noteworthy in a man of 20-something. You could pass him off as a late bloomer, but Ernest is in his early 60s, and so the game of hide and seek will forever catch Beth off guard. Yet women love him, and men yearn to be near him in hopes that some of the child will flit into their eyes. Beth has always hated this about her father. She's only ever wanted him to grow the fuck up. A bit of a hypocrisy, really, given that she, too, has a child inside her, that she had felt the child stirring, shifting in sleep when her father called her Eliza. Her anger at her father is, in part, anger at her own inner child, whom Beth can't seem to shake. "So nice to see you again," Linda says, sidling up next to Ernest, inserting herself between father and daughter. Beth remembers Linda as a horse girl who always smelled like hay and manure. Now her hair is unusually full and glossy, and her fingernails are too long for a farm girl's. None of this is to be overlooked. Even so, Linda stands with her hands on her belly, still flat like a 20-something's. Beth notes Linda's rosy cheeks, her pudgy face. Beth closes her eyes. Her father has put a child in this child. And that is it. My computer went to sleep. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about my writing this novel, but also about my mental health journey, which kind of has sort of a parallel track in many ways to writing this novel. And I'm going to be upfront with you, I'm probably going to overshare in ways that are uncomfortable, especially that given it's not May, so it's not Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're not used to hearing people talk about these things, but we're going to do it because we need to talk about them all the time. This book for me is very much about a woman who is dealing with undiagnosed depression and PTSD, which are both things that I've recently been diagnosed with myself. In Beth's case, she's not always dealing with them very gracefully. I want to say that I started writing this book in earnest in 2014 when I was in grad school, but I'd been kicking the ideas around for a while. The oldest part of this book was actually the chapter called The Leaving Behind, and I wrote that in 2013, summer of 2013, before I started grad school. But writing this book brought up a lot of issues for me. I knew I was dealing with some mental health issues that weren't really addressed yet in my life, and it came out in my character as well. And so as I started writing this book in 2014, I started to see a therapist for the first time to address my own childhood sexual trauma and PTSD from that and my own depression. And so here's my first overshare. I'm going to tell you that, the whole journey of my mental health was definitely a journey for me, right? The first therapist that I saw was very kind and understanding, but she admitted she didn't really know how to help me. I just kept looking for different therapists, and I was finally diagnosed with major depressive disorder in 2019 and PTSD in 2020. Great year for everybody, even though I'd recognized that I had the signs much earlier. And part of it was in 1998, when I was in high school and we had health class and we talked about mental health. I started to think maybe I had depression, but we didn't have health insurance, right? So there wasn't a whole lot to do about it. And to date, I have seen 7 therapists and 4 psychiatrists to get my meds right. And I feel like I'm finally on the right path. But I just want to note that some of the professionals that I've seen over the years were good professionals, and some of them were not so great. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the therapists I had when I was in California. We frequently spent more time in therapy sessions talking about her problems than mine. And the final straw was the day that I walk in, and it was a 1-room office, and she's sitting there, and the patient before me is walking out, and he looks me in the eye, he holds the door for me, and I go in and I sit down, and she started telling me about his marriage problems, and I was like, this is not okay, and we gotta go.
What?
I'm telling you all of this because I definitely want to note that not all therapists are worth it, and just keep looking, right? It's hard to find one who's not only good at their job, but who's a good fit for you. And I feel like I finally have gotten to that point, but it's taken some time. My current therapist is excellent, and I just feel like she's a really good fit, and we're on the right path, right? But it's taken a while. And I also want to mention too that I've tried many different medications at this point, and some of them were great for a while, and they stopped working, which I think is common. And some of them were terrible. When I was on Lexapro, I felt have you ever bitten down on aluminum foil? It felt like that, but inside my brain all the time. I just felt like all the time. So I just want to mention, it's definitely a journey. Keep at it, even though it's hard. And it's especially hard when you're feeling really crummy, to find a new professional and get on a new track. But just know you're not alone. People, if anybody out there needs to hear this, you're not alone. And so going back to my novel, in early drafts of my novel, I adhered very closely to the facts of my depression and my trauma. And I think it was necessary in those first drafts just to kind of like get it out, because it was something that I hadn't talked about ever before. But in writing fiction, right, it's also necessary to write the work in a way that serves the work itself. Like fiction doesn't necessarily look exactly like real life. Like it has to make a lot more sense a lot of times than real life does. And that was something that I worked on a lot more in later drafts of the novel. So in edits, I worked a lot on fictionalizing the facts more, finding moments in the story that depart from reality. And in doing so is when my main character, Beth, really became real. And one of the major things that I did was in the book, there's like kind of a almost like magical realism element where she's got like another personality that comes forth. And that was something that came out in later drafts based solely on feedback that I'd received in grad school. And also a moment in the excerpt that I just read, there was a line that something inside her stirs violently. She spills out of the car and onto the driveway. Like I liked that movement of water, and it kind of brought forth this other character, which if you've read the book, you might remember like the other character, but I'm not going to give too much away. But let's see here. What else do I have written down? I'll also say fictionalizing the facts. So there was a moment in the book where Beth gets mad at her boyfriend and punches a hole in his apartment wall, which I did. That actually happened. I was not terribly stable when I was on birth control. Like it was a bad thing for me. But and in the story, the boyfriend breaks up with her. In reality, he married me, and we're still married. And his parents are here watching, so that happened, y'all. I'm just gonna say, but so I thought about Beth as like how my life might have turned out if he had broken up with me in that moment, because in many ways my husband has been very supportive and understanding, and like my career goals and a need for like mental health care, and like all of these things that Beth doesn't have in her life. And so I kind of try to think about like what my life might have looked like if I hadn't had that support. And the support of my in-laws too. I just want to give y'all a shout out. Like they were really helpful and supportive when I decided to finally quit restaurants and go back to school and finally get a degree in English, which led to the MFA in creative writing. And here I am. I definitely like had to work very hard at fictionalizing some of these things. And that was when the story came alive and Beth became her own person and kind of her path diverged from mine in that moment. And I talked about all that. Sorry, I'm gonna skip a little bit of my notes here. And then fictionalizing Beth's life opened up new avenues in my writing, and it made it easier to write because at that point it wasn't so personal. Like it was more like speculating about how things might have been or how this other person who is in me, how her life looked. And I also, because of some of the issues with my mental health, like sometimes I'm not in the mood to like tackle the real hard stuff. And so some of these other characters that you get point of view chapters from cropped up because of that. Like Derek was a character that I wrote when I was feeling like a little bit better, but not like super strong. So he's kind of like this snarky, like unhappy, I don't know, like his humor was really fun to write and like a nice break from kind of like the deep depression that Beth was in. And so like all of these other characters cropped up in the process of this. And people often ask me like how I write so many characters and make them feel real. And so I don't know if this is a good time to kind of segue into, I have like a little bit of a craft talk on writing characters, or if we want to do any audience questions at this point. I don't know, what do you think, Nicole?
Well, we can wait a little bit for audience questions, see if anyone has anything right now. And in the meantime, I will say that as a reader, I do really appreciate those humor breaks as well, because you get so involved in this character that is, you know, having such a difficult time and you feel like you're living through her. And sometimes you do just need to jump into somebody that's doing something silly or having a hard time at school or, just something that isn't that for a moment. So I think we can really sympathize with you there. And you were saying as well that as much as Beth is fictionalized, the part that you are reading, where Beth is in the car and she's really disassociating, that feels so real. That is that is exactly the way that feels. And even if you've never felt that before, you really are able to get into that mindset there. And that has to come in some way from you giving that character a part of yourself, I assume.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say she was dissociating there. Like, I wasn't necessarily aware that that's what she was doing because I didn't know about us dissociating. Mm-hmm. That's actually something that apparently I do a lot. That's come up in therapy, and like we're kind of working on ways to like get me grounded and keep me present more often. Yeah, she does definitely kind of slip out a little bit there.
All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions yet, so you can go ahead and move on if you'd like to.
Okay. I was going to share my screen and now I don't remember. Oh, it's right there. It's the big green button. Okay, so I have, if I can find where I opened it, there it is. I have a little craft talk on writing realistic characters.
Oh, actually, sorry, before you start, you did say you didn't mind if I interrupt.
No.
We do have a question. Wendy asked, or she says, you said that you started writing at a chapter that wasn't the first one and that you were writing as your feelings and moods take you. Do you write and weave the storylines together, or do you have an outline that you follow? Like, what kind of, are you a process writer?
I'm trying very hard with my next novels to follow an outline because no, I did not at all. And I definitely would jump around in writing. Like sometimes I'd write a chapter from Derek. Sometimes I'd work on Paula, and I wouldn't just write a whole chapter and be done with it. Like I'd come back and forth depending on my mood. And so there were drafts and drafts and drafts with my editor where we worked on like making sure the timeline flowed in one direction, making sure that the details were consistent. And it was a real pain in the butt. Like I definitely recommend if you can get yourself to stick to a timeline, do that, or to stick to an outline to do that. But it's really hard for me. Like I'm really struggling to stay. And part of what I'm doing now is instead of working on different chapters of one novel, I'm working on 3 different novels depending on my moods. I'm hoping that'll help, but I don't know. Yeah, no, I don't do that, and I should. But that's a good question.
Do you remember what was the very first scene that you started writing?
Yeah, it was the leaving behind, and I remember this because so it's a chapter that takes place back in 1998, I want to say, and it details like this relationship that Beth has with this man. And I remember I was writing it. I was working at the writing center at the University of Houston, and the coveted job at the writing center was to work the front desk because there wasn't a whole lot to do, so you could write while you were working. And I just started. I'd written "you" was the first word that I wrote of the story. And my friend Anthony came in and he's like, "What you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm writing a story. You want to see what I have so far?" And I showed him, and it's just "you." And he's like, "I thought you'd be a little farther along than that." But yeah, that was the very first thing that I wrote. Yeah, so if we don't have any other questions, I guess I'll jump into the craft talk. So can y'all see the craft talk?
Yep.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so I have this craft talk, writing realistic characters, which, oh no, what are you doing? There we go. Here's like the family trees that are in the beginning of my novel, just to give you an idea of how many characters are in my novel. And like a lot of these you get like point of view sections from. And so keeping them all straight and distinct was, I don't know, a process. And in thinking about creating characters, I want to talk a little bit about some other books that I love and like character descriptions and things that they've done really well. So the first one I have is an excerpt from Evan S. Connell's Mrs. Bridge, which is kind of, it's actually one of the books that I was reading when I started writing my novel. I started writing my novel in Robert Boswell's fiction forms class, and we were reading, I think, 4 different books that had 4 different forms, and then kind of like writing in 4 different forms to see what stuck, which is kind of part of why my book is the form that it is, because we were like, one was Mrs. Bridge, which is in vignettes. One was a book that was a novel and stories. One was a book that took place all in one day. And one was a book that took place all in 1 year. And so trying these different forms, like the vignettes and the novel and stories, were the ones that really stuck. And so my book's kind of a hybrid of those. But so Mrs. Bridge, this is the opening to the novel. Her first name was India. She was never able to get used to it. It seemed to her that her parents must have been thinking of someone else when they named her. Or were they hoping for another sort of daughter? As a child, she was often on the point of inquiring, but time passed and she never did. Now and then, while she was growing up, the idea came to her that she could get along very nicely without a husband, and to the distress of her mother and father, this idea prevailed for a number of years after her education had been completed. But there came a summer evening, and a young lawyer named Walter Bridge, very tall and dignified, red-haired, with a grimly determined, intelligent face, and rather stoop-shouldered, so that even when he stood erect, his coat hung lower in the front than in the back. She had known him for several years without finding him remarkable in any way, but on this summer evening, on the front porch of her parents' home, she toyed with a sprig of mint and looked at him attentively while pretending to listen to what he said. And I love this excerpt for a number of reasons. So the book, Mrs. Bridge, is very much like, this character is very much a person who like will maintain the status quo at all costs. She doesn't stir the waters. And so the first line, her name was India, which she was never able to get used to. I love how it kind of like gets right into her personality, shows that she wants to blend in, she wants to be like normal. Then as a child, she was often on the point of inquiring, but time passed and she never did. That's kind of sets up the entire book for her. Like, there's all of these things, all of these opportunities for change that she's presented with, and she never takes any of them. So like the opening starts very strong to like create this character right from the start. And the beginning of her relationship with Mr. Bridge seems to lack heat. She describes him as grimly determined, stoop-shouldered, and she's pretending to listen to what he said. Like, none of this is terribly romantic. It's not like the dreamy love story that you kind of expect from the start of a romance. So it shows, how their marriage is really based on comfort and expectation more than any passion that either of them might have. So when I'm thinking about elements of character and writing characters, I like to think about their backstory, right? So like this opening of Mrs. Bridge kind of shows their backstory and how they got together and their personalities when they met. So I think about backstory in terms of like family and relationships, in terms of community context, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I also like to think of characters and their trauma. Like I feel like human beings are just like big bags of trauma and insecurities and baggage. And if you can get at these ideas and the things that are like holding the character back, or the things that the character is trying to hide from the world, it really will help you like get into the heart of the character way more than physical descriptions, or like even objects in their home. Although these objects can be useful and like supporting this backstory, I feel like the backstory itself is what you want to get at. And when I'm talking about wants, anxieties, and insecurities, like those meat of who people are and what makes them do what they do, it's best to like show these through dialogue and through body language. And ways that you can kind of understand a little bit more about human beings and what their body language means, what their dialogue means, like what they're saying, but also what they're not saying, what's implied behind what they're saying, is simply by people watching. Like I know we can't really do this right now, but like go to a public space when the world opens again and just watch people and like how they move their bodies, how people talk, and then consider the context of the character, like what communities the character belongs to, and whether or not they feel like they're an insider in this community or an outsider. And like in Mrs. Bridges' case, I almost feel like she feels a little bit like an outsider. She's trying so desperately to be an insider and keep her family like normal and keep appearances like as they should be. As you're people watching, then it's helpful to keep notes, just like write down, little gestures or little snippets of dialogue. And then using those gestures and dialogue, then you can move on to creating a character profile, right? And note their age and family and important relationships. Things like their birthdays, right, can be useful, especially for novels that span more than a year. It can be helpful just to keep track of when their age will change so that, if they're about to turn 40, maybe they're headed into a midlife crisis like I am. And then also writing their trauma. And again, like we all have it, it shapes us profoundly. Writing their insecurities and hangups, and keep adding to these notes as you write. So just kind of like take those snippets of people watching, the gestures, the dialogue that you gleaned, and use them to try to communicate these issues about the characters, like these details about the character's life. And writing dialogue, I feel like that's a super important part. And something that I find when I'm reading, like I really love fiction where the dialogue doesn't tell you the plot so much as it tells you who the character is and what they want you to see about them. So when writing dialogues, you would include those speech patterns that you noted from people watching, but you use it more for character development. We've all heard the saying, show, don't tell. Using the dialogue to move plot along often results in telling. And dialogue is a chance to bring up a character's insecurities, which again, they won't necessarily tell you outright, but they will talk around them, trying to hide what makes them uncomfortable. And actually there's a chapter that got cut from my novel, but it was about Paige and her wife. And the entire chapter came along. And actually, now I think about it, that was the very first thing that I wrote that didn't make it in the novel, but that was the very first part of the story that I wrote, was Paige and Diane. And it came about because I was at CBS one day and there were two women standing in line in front of me and they were buying a pregnancy test. And there was something about their body language. I didn't think they were sisters. I didn't think they were friends. I thought they were together, but they looked very nervous buying this pregnancy test. And I was like, oh my God, what's the story there? And it just turned into a short story that, then was a chapter that got deleted from the novel. So yeah, just people watching is the best inspiration for writing that I know of. And so I'm talking a little bit about dialogue that really reveals character. I have an excerpt from Jamel Brinkley's A Lucky Man. And it's the story that's called, I don't speak French, so I'm going to murder this, but Javert, 1996.
You got it.
Woo! And what you just need to know is that this is a little boy who's kind of been kicked out of, he's not that little, he's a high schooler, but he's been kicked out of his house while his mom is entertaining a guy. And so he's wandered around with his little brother and he ends up at the park and there's these men at the park and they're just shooting the breeze. And they're talking about, they're talking kind of lightly, but they're talking about really heavy stuff, the over-incarceration of Black men, basically. And he's listening to this, and then he says, when I get locked up, I said, I don't want my woman acting up like that, no matter how many years I get. Not if she's supposed to love me. Cuffy, one of the guys at the park, Cuffy set his hat farther back in his head. So you planning on going to jail? Might as well, if it's in the cards, like you say, if everybody's there. He looked around. Sydney cleared his throat. Sydney's another guy in the park, and said, every Black man don't go to prison, son. His tone had changed. I mean, we ain't there. He spoke as if I was very small and sitting in his lap. Lucky you, I spat. I realized I was standing. They all stared. I had forgotten how I looked. And he had a really bad haircut that his mom gave him. He'd taken off his t-shirt and wrapped it around his head to hide it. So he'd forgotten how he looked. They continued to stare, and it felt like a coordinated effort to humiliate me. The breeze warmed my bare chest. On my head, the t-shirt felt bloated and heavy. You ain't no better than the ones who are, I said. Nobody said that, little dude. There's no reason to be yelling. And I think that this dialogue is excellent for a number of reasons. First of all, Brinkley is great at capturing the natural rhythms of speech. I don't want my woman acting up like that. Not as she's supposed to love me. I just feel like the dialogue flows really naturally. Even if I trip over my tongue a little bit while reading it, that's not Brinkley's fault. It's my fault. But I love the moment where you can see the characters beginning to get angry. And he says, Coffee, he spoke as if I was very small and sitting in his lap. Like, this character who's I think he's like 17 or so, who wants to be grown up, to feel infantilized in that way is just going to really tick him off. And then it further shows the character's emotions through the reaction we get from Cuffy. He says there's no reason to be yelling. And I feel like sloppier writing would have been like, he would have had him yelling things and like exclamation points, and it would have been like, the dialogue tag would have been like, I yelled, but all of that's not necessary. When you write the dialogue in a way that is revealing of the character, you can let the characters do some of that work for you. So Coffee says, there's no reason to be yelling. The narrator doesn't have to do it. And you know that it's happening. The community context of this, you can see that there are ways that this character doesn't fit into his community. He's younger than the men in the park. He's participating in conversation that he's too young to quite grasp. And the men in the park are just kind of shooting the breeze, but this kid's emotions take the conversation in a much more heated direction. And then the physical detail of him trying to hide his haircut with that t-shirt that he took off and wrapped around his head, it really helps to like bolster that sense of insecurity that he has. I spoke a little bit about dialogue tags, but I like it when writers use these sparingly. I feel like most of the time dialogue, if it's right, you don't need more than just like he asked or she said. And then when you do switch up the dialogue tags, like in the moment where Brinkley writes that the character spat what he said, right? You get more impact, right? Than if you're switching them up all the time. So we had the moment where he says, you ain't no better than the ones who are in jail, I said. And then nobody said that, little dude, there's no reason to be yelling. Like, again, I talked about this already, but you don't need it to be like, you ain't no better than the ones who are, exclamation point, I yelled, because you get it from Cuffy. And then the body language, again, inspired by people watching, which is a hugely important part of communication. It's best when it helps to not only portray the characters once, but their emotional state. The character realized he was standing instead of like, I suddenly stood to my feet and like flapped my arms or whatever. Like, it's very concise, it's very direct, and it keeps you in the moment and in the character's emotions, which I love. I think it's brilliant. Sorry, I'm talking really fast and I should probably slow down. And then, another book that I was reading when I was in grad school, so Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road, I thought this book was amazing in how these characters fought. Like, they have some epic fights in this book. And like, I'm guessing the majority of y'all are Michiganders like myself. And I know we have a tendency in Michigan to like kind of shy away from arguments and shy away from conversations and keep things nice and light. And I found when I was writing that it was hard to like get into a fight and like stay in the fight. And so I took Revolutionary Road and I kind of made a template of one of their arguments that they had. It was this argument that I'm going to talk about. And I just wrote things like, the character says something, like accuses the other character of something here, or the character, makes a gesture that reflects their emotional state. And I use this template then that I made from Revolutionary Road to get more mileage out of like the fight that Paula and Jorge have in the book, like before she comes back to Michigan. So I don't know, like I just find it helpful sometimes to kind of have these workarounds when you're writing to like know what your limitations are, what your tendencies are in writing to like try to work around them. But anyway, Revolutionary Road, I have this excerpt of a fight they're having, and they had been driving in the car, and now they're, let me see here. Yeah, they're out of the car. And she's kind of got her back to him. But it says he came up behind her and stood uncertainly, breathing hard, keeping his distance. She wasn't crying. She was only standing there with her back to him. What the hell, he said. What the hell is this all about? Come on back to the car. No, I will in a minute. Just let me stand here a minute, all right? His arms flapped and fell. Then, as the sound and the lights of an approaching car came up behind them, he put one hand in his pocket and assumed a conversational slouch for the sake of appearances. And again, we have like a community, the characters in a community where they just very much want to seem normal and keep up appearances. And you see this even in their argument, in their like most emotional and heated moment. He's still just trying to like look like he's normal. But to go into body language a little bit, he's breathing hard, and it doesn't have to say like because he's angry, you know it's because his emotions are getting the better of him. I love the gesture when his arms flapped and fell. It's such a great, like completely useless motion that he makes there, and really shows like he's completely at a loss for what to say and what to do in this moment. And April, the main character, it says she keeps her back to him, which shows that she's like completely fed up. Like she can't even look at him in this moment. And these little body language moments just help the story and help these characters feel real. And again, like the community context of this scene is that these are characters who want to keep up appearances. Like that's what the book is about, mostly, in my opinion. And it's further developed when Frank, the guy in the scene, when Frank pauses in the middle of the argument and assumes a conversational slouch because a car passes. Like he doesn't even know who's in the car and whether it's someone he cares about keeping up appearances for. He wants to keep up appearances for everybody, right? And it shows just how much he wants to be an insider in his community. And talking about their wants, anxieties, and insecurities, which again are best shown through actions and dialogue rather than through narration. And it often ties back into dialogue, as most characters will say things that portray them. Here I have an excerpt from Disha Philya's, and you can read this on BuzzFeed. I have down at the bottom here, I have the, if you want to copy the URL or whatever, but her Secret Lives of Church Ladies was, it's a collection. It was a finalist for the National Book Award this year. And it's also, HBO just bought it. They're going to make a series. I'm super excited about that. They're going to do that. And Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death, like the same producer is going to do it. And I'm super jazzed. But so this is a scene in which you have Eula and Caroletta, who are old friends. They've been friends forever, and they're church ladies, of course, but they're also more than friends. And so in this moment, let me see here, what's the excerpt I have? So they're in this moment, they're sitting in a hotel room after they've just made love, and they're talking. And Eula says, Caroletta, I hope you haven't given up on finding you a husband. I'm on a mission, and you can be too. Eula sounds flat, like the world's most exhausted sales lady. She scoots away from me on the edge of the bed, looking at the TV. Eula, turn around and look at me, please. Eula shakes her head. To the TV, she says, I don't want to die a virgin. Do you want to die a virgin? I guess I wait a beat too long to respond. Eula whips around to face me. You aren't? I don't know what's funnier, that Eula thinks my 40-year-old ass hasn't had sex with a man in all these many years, or that she still considers us both virgins after all we've done together in those same years. So they've been sleeping together for years now. And I like this excerpt in how it shows like the wants, anxieties, and insecurities of these characters. Eula's language shows how insecure she is. She thinks getting married will make life okay for her. But then she also wants Caroletta to be okay. And she says, I hope you haven't given up on finding a husband. And Eula's insecurities come through as she keeps her back turned to Caroletta to have this difficult conversation, which is always a very telling sign. Like if you're talking to someone and you can't look at them, like that's that's super telling of like your emotional state, but also like just how you fight as a person. It tells a lot about your character, I think. And then Eula is so shocked by the revelation of Caroletta's sex life that she whips around. And I think that finding like the right verb when you have like the gestures is important, in like, I don't know, just keeping brevity, but like getting just the right moment and the right action to show her shock. She whips around. But in the community, in the context of the community that these characters are in, these women are operating within a Christian community that doesn't accept same-sex love. And you can see the physical tension that this creates between them as Eula keeps her back to Caroletta, even though they're sitting on the bed together in this room when they've just had a very intimate moment, and now they're having intimate conversation, and there's still this distance between them. And then I don't know. Oh, wow. Time has flown. I had a writing prompt if anybody wanted to try it, but I think we're probably going to do Q&A at this point. So maybe I just skip the writing prompt and I can make it available somehow online if anybody wants it. But that is my talk that I can't seem to stop sharing on my screen now.
If you click at the top, you should have the option to, I can do it. I'm in control here. Unless anyone would like to keep it open for a minute so you can write down that prompt if you'd like.
I could read it out real fast too if that helps. I don't know. Is there a way we can make it available to people, like throw it up on a website somewhere? Or
if you will send me this, I will send it to, or you know what? I don't know if we can get it in chat or what.
I'll put it up on my website. So Jeni McFarland.com. I'm going to put it up as soon as this is over. That's what I'm going to do.
Let me type that in the box.
Oh, there it is. Sure. Oh, sorry. I guess we aren't going to do that yet. That's okay.
We have Al or possibly Chris, I'm not sure, saying they loved the family tree technique. Since they listened to most of their books out loud, a visual would help them keep the characters straight. Mm-hmm. I think that would actually be very easy if they put it on the back of the audiobook.
Yeah.
I really liked your technique of defining a character based on their trauma, because I think normally we phrase that as it being based on their motivation, and we don't really think, where's that motivation coming from? But you realize that by framing it as trauma, you realize that most of your motivation is coming from the things that have hurt you, the things that you are trying to either fix or get past or cover up and, pretend you're not insecure about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wendy asks, do you foresee writing another novel based on your life or situations that you've seen yourself in?
Probably not, or at least not intentionally. I think everything I write, I put a lot of myself into, but I'm intentionally, like right now, one of the novels I'm working on is a fantasy. So I'm very intentionally working on other people and other worlds to try to get away from that a little bit, just because it's rough. It's really hard.
Do you find it more difficult to write characters that you don't really have that emotional connection to, that you don't really have that experience? Or
yeah, I don't know. I find I doubt myself more. I doubt whether I have the right to write this thing or whether I'm doing it correctly. I'm not much of a researcher, so I don't research my writing. So yeah, it's easier in some ways to write things that I've experienced, but also, I don't know, it's harder than to go and pimp your book when you're like, hey, this is a book about my sexual trauma. I don't know, it's just weird.
Right. Do we have any other questions? We'll give them a moment. It may take a while to write. Can you tell us anything You said you're writing 3 novels right now. Can you tell us anything that might be upcoming?
Yeah, I have one that I talk about, and then the others are just kind of like secret writing. So like the fantasy is one of my secret writings. I'm gonna keep that to myself. But the other one, the one that I have the most done on at this point, and by the most I mean about 40 pages, so I'm not very far in, is a modern adaptation of Phantom of the Opera. And so it's set in a country club. I used to be a pastry chef at a country club, and it's an illicit romance between a pastry chef and an executive chef. And I was obsessed with Phantom of the Opera when I was growing up. Like I went to see it. My great grandmother took us when I was like 12. And after that, I was hooked on musicals. And I was one of those people that was just kind of like, it's so romantic. Like you love so much. And then I grew up and I was like, oh no, this is really messed up. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit about like why some of the stories that we tell ourselves as are romantic, like why we romanticize these really messed up stories. Yeah.
That's a really good one to pick. That's very messed up.
Yeah.
It's second only to Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
But people really are loving these modern adaptations lately, so I can see that going really well. Excited to read it.
Okay.
Well, we don't have anyone else asking any questions, so unless there was anything else that you have to bring up.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have Allison says that she's not originally from America and would like to read more novels based in Michigan. Are there any Michigan authors that sort of inspired you?
I just this past summer read Megan Giddings' Lakewood, which is set in Michigan, and it's so good. And it's
right.
So I would definitely recommend that. And I'm trying to think of other Michigan novels, and I'm coming up blank.
I think that one was that's another one where it's very, well, more so even than your novel. It was very hard to understand, I think, sometimes where she was in her head, because there was so much going on with her, but It was such a good one. I would definitely also recommend Lakewood. We have that as well in our library, so that's a good one. Geez. You know when someone asks you a question and you just pull up an automatic blank of,
yeah,
I should know this. Allison, I am going to send you a list of Michigan authors that you might enjoy. Particularly, you might enjoy if you, obviously, if you like Jeni's work, stuff that will be similar. So I'm going to send you that in an email, okay? Anybody else? You are welcome. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jeni, for doing this. And I feel like I just learned so much. So I hope everybody else did too. And thank you for letting us record this. We did have a couple people even in the very beginning that were like, oops, we signed up and we aren't going to be able to make it. Could you please send this to us? So I'm glad that they reached out for that. We have a lot of thanks in the chat room. Oh, yeah, Al did say, we listened to the short story about the ear and it was great.
Okay.
So thank you for being here, and everybody that attended, thank you for attending, and I think we are going to end it here.
Thank you for having me. This was great.